The plastic DNA test kit skidded across the polished mahogany of my father's casket, bouncing once before landing right next to a spray of white lilies. 300 mourners in the cathedral went silent instantly, the echo of the plastic box hitting the wood, hanging in the air like a gunshot. My half-sister Chloe stood at the altar, her face twisted in a sneer, pointing a black-gloved finger directly at me in the front row. "If you want a single penny of this family's money," she announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "you are going to prove you actually belong here first." My name is Morgan Lancaster. I am 29 years old, the chief financial officer of a scorching hot fintech startup in San Francisco, and a woman who has spent her entire life being treated like a stain on a silk dress. To the business world, I am the Ice Queen, a numbers genius who can spot a fraudulent ledger from a mile away. But to the people in this room, the high society elite of New York, I am just the waitress's mistake, the illegitimate child Richard Lancaster was forced to acknowledge, but never allowed to love. I sat perfectly still in the pew, my hands folded in my lap. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I just stared at the plastic box resting on the man who had given me life, but had rarely spoken more than 10 words to me at a time. If you have ever been the black sheep of your family, the one who had to work twice as hard just to be ignored, drop a like on this video. And if you want to see exactly what happens when a spoiled heiress accidentally destroys her own life in front of the entire family estate, hit that subscribe button. Because what Chloe didn't know was that she hadn't just thrown a test kit at me, she had thrown a grenade into her own future. The funeral itself had been a masterclass in narcissism. My stepmother Vanessa was draped in vintage Chanel mourning blacks, weeping into a lace handkerchief that I noticed was completely dry every time she lowered it. She threw herself onto the casket twice for the cameras, wailing about her beloved Richard, a man she had spent the last 20 years isolating, medicating, and controlling. I had arrived alone. No entourage, no designer mourning veil, just a simple black dress and the sharp mind that had made me a millionaire in my own right, something Vanessa and Chloe hated more than anything. They wanted me to be the beggar. They wanted me to be the desperate, illegitimate daughter scratching at the door for a handout. The fact that I didn't need their money drove them absolutely insane. For years, the dynamic had been civil. A whisper at a gala that I didn't have the Lancaster chin, a Christmas card where I was positioned on the far edge, easily cropped out if necessary. But today, with Richard gone, the gloves were off. They didn't have to pretend to tolerate me anymore. Half an hour before the service started, I had tried to escape the suffocating scent of lilies and expensive perfume by ducking into the small vestry room off the main hall. I was checking my work email, trying to ground myself in the logic of spreadsheets, when the heavy oak door creaked open. It wasn't a family member. It was Elena, the head housekeeper who had run the Lancaster estate for 30 years. She looked older, her face lined with genuine grief, the only real tears I had seen all day. She checked the hallway to make sure no one was watching, then stepped inside and locked the door behind her. "Morgan," she whispered, reaching into the pocket of her cardigan. "Your father, he knew this day was coming. He knew what they would do to you." She pressed a heavy, cold object into my palm. I looked down. It was an old-fashioned iron skeleton key, the metal worn smooth by years of use. I recognized it instantly. It was the key to the master study in the east wing of the estate, the only room in the mansion that was strictly forbidden to everyone, including Vanessa, especially Vanessa. "He told me to give this to you the moment he was gone," Elena said, her voice trembling. "He said you are the only one who knows how to use what is inside." "Why didn't he just talk to me, Elena?" I asked, the old hurt rising up. "Why did he let them treat me like this?" Elena squeezed my hand. "Because he was protecting you, child. If Vanessa knew what he was really doing, she would have destroyed it all. Go to the study tonight, before the reading of the will tomorrow." She slipped out as quickly she had entered, leaving me with the cold iron key burning a hole in my pocket. That key was the only reason I didn't walk out of the cathedral the moment Chloe threw her tantrum. I knew something they didn't. I just didn't know what it was yet. Back in the main hall, the shock of the DNA kit hitting the casket had faded into a low, buzzing murmur among the guests. Uncle Marcus, my father's brother and a member of the board, looked horrified. He started to stand up to intervene, but Vanessa placed a hand on his arm, her eyes hard. She wanted this. Chloe marched down from the altar, her heels clicking aggressively on the stone floor. She stopped right in front of my pew, creating a scene that she knew would be the talk of the Upper East Side for decades. We all know why you're here, Morgan, Chloe hissed, loud enough for the back row to hear. You think because Dad is dead, you can finally cash in. But we've been talking to the lawyers. The will says the estate goes to his children, his biological children. She gestured to the kit on the casket. Mom and I are tired of the charade. Everyone knows your mother was just some gold digger waitress Dad met on a business trip. We don't even think you're his. So here is the deal. You take the test or you leave right now and don't bother showing up to the reading tomorrow. Vanessa stood up then, gliding over to stand beside her daughter. She looked down at me with a pitying smile that made my stomach turn. It's only fair, Morgan, Vanessa purred. We have to protect Richard's legacy from opportunists. If you have nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem. Unless, of course, you already know the truth. The trap was clumsy, but effective. If I refused, I looked like a fraud. If I accepted, I was dancing to their tune, submitting to their humiliation. They expected me to run. They expected the waitress's daughter to crumble under the pressure of 300 pairs of judgmental eyes. But they had forgotten one thing. I wasn't just Morgan the outcast anymore. I was a CFO who stared down hostile takeovers for breakfast. I dealt with facts, not feelings. And the fact was, I had a key in my pocket that felt heavier by the second. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress. I towered over Chloe by 3 inches. I didn't look at Vanessa. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked straight into Chloe's eyes. I accept, I said, my voice calm, projecting clearly to the back of the room. Chloe blinked, surprised by my lack of hesitation. Good, then, on one condition, I cut her off. I stepped out of the pew and walked over to the casket. I picked up the plastic box. It felt cheap and light. I turned back to face them. You speak so much about protecting the bloodline, Chloe, about ensuring only the real Lancasters inherit. I walked toward David Thorne, the family attorney, who was sitting in the 3rd row, looking pale. I handed him the kit. I will take the test, I announced, but if we are verifying legitimacy, we are going to be thorough. I will only submit my sample if every single person claiming to be an heir submits theirs as well. That includes you, Chloe. Chloe laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. I don't need to take a test. I'm his daughter. I grew up in his house. Then you have nothing to fear, I said, repeating Vanessa's words back to her. Unless, of course, you already know the truth. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. I saw a flicker of genuine panic in Vanessa's eyes, just for a microsecond before she masked it with outrage. This is ridiculous, Vanessa snapped. Chloe is his legitimate child. This is an insult. It's a condition, I said, turning to David Thorne. David, does the estate cover the cost of paternity verification for all beneficiaries? David stood up, adjusting his glasses. He looked from me to Vanessa, and I saw a strange spark in his eyes. Was it respect? Actually, David said, his voice clearing, the will does contain a specific clause regarding identity verification. If one beneficiary is challenged, fairness dictates all must be vetted to the same standard. Morgan is within her rights. I smiled at Chloe. It wasn't a nice smile. Your move, princess. You want to expose the truth? Let's expose it all. Vanessa looked like she wanted to strangle me, but with the entire room watching, she was cornered. She squeezed Chloe's shoulder hard. Fine, Vanessa spat.
We will play your little game. Test everyone. It will just make it sweeter when you are thrown out on the street. Tomorrow, I said, at the reading. I turned and walked out of the cathedral without looking back. My hands were steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. I had bought myself 24 hours. I headed straight for my rental car. I wasn't going back to my hotel. I was going to the estate. I had a date with a locked room and a ghost who had left me a roadmap in the form of an iron key. They thought they had just humiliated me. They had no idea they had just authorized the investigation that would end them. I parked the rental car a half-mile down the service road and walked the rest of the way through the meticulously landscaped grounds of the Lancaster estate. It was 2 a.m. Through the towering windows of the main house, I could see the chandeliers still blazing in the west wing. Vanessa and Chloe were hosting a post-funeral reception, which was really just a victory lap with 50 of their closest sycophants, drinking vintage champagne and celebrating their imminent ownership of a billion-dollar empire. They were so busy toasting themselves that they didn't notice the shadow slipping into the darkened east wing.
I stood before the heavy oak door of the master study. My hand trembled slightly as I slid the iron skeleton key Elena had given me into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper, pipe tobacco, and silence. I flipped on the desk lamp, keeping the light low. For 20 years, I had been told this room was the command center of a man who didn't care about me. Vanessa had always said, "Your father is busy with important matters, Morgan. He doesn't have time for your little school projects." But as the golden light washed over the room, I stopped breathing. The walls weren't covered in stock certificates or photos of Chloe's debutante balls. They were covered in me. Framed on the wall was my high school valedictorian speech. On the mantel sat a photo of me accepting my degree from Wharton, a ceremony Richard hadn't attended, or so I thought. In the corner, a stack of Wall Street journals was bookmarked, every mention of my name highlighted in yellow marker. I walked to the massive mahogany desk, my chest tightening. He hadn't ignored me. He had been watching every single step, collecting scraps of my life in secret because the woman he married would have burned them if she found them. I sat in his leather chair, feeling the weight of the moment, but I forced myself to focus. Elena had said he left me the tools to destroy them. I opened the center drawer. There was a small, high-security biometric safe built into the wood. Next to it, a sticky note with a handwritten riddle. The day the ice cracked. I knew instantly. It wasn't a birthday. It was the date of my first major public failure, a botched interview when I was 22 that had humiliated me. Dad had called me that night, not to scold, but to tell me to get back up. I punched in the date. The safe beeped and popped open. Inside, there were no stacks of cash or diamonds. There were just 2 thick file folders. The first was labeled Project V. I opened it and felt a cold smile touch my lips. It was a forensic accounting ledger, a shadow ledger. For the last 5 years, Richard had been tracking Vanessa's spending. Every charity gala, every consulting fee paid to her friends, every renovation cost that was inflated by 300%. She had siphoned nearly $3 million into shell companies registered in her maiden name. This wasn't just greed. Under the bad faith clause of her prenuptial agreement, this was grounds for total forfeiture. But it was the second folder that made the world stop spinning. It was a medical file from Memorial Sloan Kettering dated 12 years ago. I remembered that year. Chloe had been 14 and battling an aggressive form of leukemia. She had needed a bone marrow transplant. The family story was that a mysterious donor had been found in Germany at the last minute. I flipped open the file. The document on top was an HLA typing report. Patient Chloe Lancaster. Donor candidate Richard Lancaster. I scanned down to the results. The medical jargon was dense, but the conclusion was circled in red ink by the attending physician. Donor incompatible. Loci must match across all markers.
Genetic probability of paternity, 0%. Exclusion confirmed. I stared at the page, the room spinning. Richard wasn't Chloe's father. There was a handwritten note from Richard clipped to the back. Vanessa confessed. The biological father is her tennis instructor from the club. I cannot destroy Chloe while she is fighting for her life. I will keep the secret until she is strong enough to bear the truth, or until I am gone. He had stayed. He had raised a child that wasn't his, paid for her treatments, and kept the secret to save her life, all while Vanessa treated his actual biological daughter like garbage. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. Vanessa and Chloe had demanded a DNA test to humiliate me, completely forgetting that 12 years ago, science had already proven their own fraud. They were so convinced of their own lie that they had forgotten it was a lie. I took photos of every page with my phone, then placed the originals in my bag. I locked the safe, turned off the lamp, and slipped out of the East Wing just as the party was winding down. At 7 the next morning, 3 hours before the reading, I walked into the glass-walled offices of Thorne and Associates. David Thorne was waiting for me in the conference room, a fresh pot of coffee on the table. He didn't look surprised to see me. "Did you find it?" he asked. I slid the medical file across the table. David glanced at it, then closed his eyes and sighed. He wanted to tell you for years, but he was terrified Vanessa would weaponize Chloe's health against him. "We're going to finish it today, David," I said. "The DNA test swabs from yesterday, have they been processed?" "Expedited," David said. "The lab ran them overnight. The courier is 5 minutes away." "And the clause?" David pulled out the leather-bound copy of the last will and testament. He flipped to page 42. The paternity verification protocol. It states that in the event of a challenge to the lineage of any beneficiary, the estate will rely solely on biological verification. Specifically, the estate shall be distributed solely to my biological issue. He looked up at me over his glasses. "If we execute this, Morgan, there is no going back. It's the nuclear option. Chloe will lose her identity. Vanessa will lose her freedom." I thought about the scrapbook in the study.
I thought about the way Chloe threw that plastic kit on my father's casket. I thought about 29 years of being made to feel small so they could feel big. They pulled the pin, David, I said, leaning back in the chair. I'm just directing the blast. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from the lab courier service. Results delivered, front desk. David stood up and buttoned his jacket. His face was grim but determined. It is done, he said. Let's go to the house. We gathered the files. The car was waiting. It was time to go home. The library of the Lancaster estate was designed to make people feel small. 2 stories of dark walnut bookshelves loomed over a long conference table that had been carved from a single slab of oak in the 19th century. The air smelled of beeswax and old money. This was the room where my father had merged corporations, crushed competitors, and built an empire. Today, it was the room where Vanessa intended to crush me. When David Thorne and I walked in at 10 o'clock sharp, the atmosphere was already suffocating. Vanessa sat at the head of the table, a spot my father had occupied for 40 years. She had already begun redecorating in her mind, gesturing to an interior designer she had brazenly invited to the reading. The drapes are too heavy, Vanessa was saying, waving a manicured hand at the velvet curtains. We need something lighter, silk perhaps, and that portrait of Richard needs to be moved to the hallway. It dominates the room too much. She stopped when she saw me. Her eyes narrowed, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes stretched across her face. Morgan, she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. I'm surprised you showed up. I thought you might have reconsidered after yesterday's little stunt. Chloe sat to her right, dressed in a sleek black silk dress that cost more than my first car. She looked like the grieving heiress from a magazine spread, complete with a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light every time she checked her watch.
She tapped a manicured fingernail against a thick manila envelope sitting in front of her. Let's just get this over with, Chloe said, bored. I have a brunch at noon. Uncle Marcus sat at the far end of the table, looking uncomfortable. He gave me a curt nod, his eyes full of pity. He thought he was about to watch his niece get disinherited. He had no idea he was sitting in the splash zone. I took the seat directly opposite Vanessa. I didn't open my bag. I didn't take out a notepad. I just folded my hands on the table and waited. David Thorne took his place at the center, placing his leather briefcase on the wood with a heavy thud. He opened it slowly, deliberately arranging 3 stacks of documents. The silence in the room grew heavier with each second. Good morning, David began, his tone professional and cold. We are here to execute the last will and testament of Richard Lancaster. However, before we proceed to the asset distribution, we must address the preliminary matter raised by Miss Chloe Lancaster yesterday. Vanessa leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. The DNA test, she interrupted. Exactly. We demand those results be read first, before we waste time reading bequests to people who have no legal claim to this family. Mom is right, Chloe chimed in, tossing her hair over her shoulder. Dad's will is for his children. If Morgan isn't his, which we all know she isn't, she shouldn't even be in the room for the rest of it. Security should be standing by. I felt a muscle in my jaw jump, but I kept my face completely blank. This was the moment. They were pushing for the very thing that would destroy them. David looked at me. Morgan, do you have any objection to the paternity results being disclosed prior to the reading of the will? No objection, I said softly. David turned back to Vanessa. He pulled a specific document from his stack, a single sheet of heavy bond paper with a signature line at the bottom. Very well, David said. However, because this request deviates from standard protocol and involves a challenge to the lineage of a beneficiary, I need all parties to sign this binding stipulation. It confirms that you are formally requesting the enforcement of the Paternity Verification Protocol Clause. He slid the paper toward Vanessa. This document states that you agree strictly by the biological findings, David explained, his voice careful. It confirms that the estate is to be distributed solely based on biological issue, as per Richard's specific instructions. Once signed, the results are binding. There is no appeal. There is no spirit of the will argument. It is purely biological. It was a warning, a massive neon-flashing warning sign. David was giving them one last chance to back down, to settle for the generous trust funds Richard had likely set up for Chloe regardless of biology, just to keep the peace. But arrogance is a blinder. Vanessa didn't see a warning. She saw a weapon. She saw a piece of paper that would legally bind me to my own eviction. Oh, give me the pen, Vanessa scoffed. She snatched a Mont Blanc from the table and signed the document with a flourish, the scratching sound loud in the quiet library.
I don't know why you have to make everything so dramatic, David. We just want to protect Richard's legacy from frauds. She slid the paper to Chloe. Sign it, darling. Let's make it official. Chloe signed her name with a smirk, dotting the I with a sharp jab. Done. Now, can we please open the envelope? I want to see the look on her face. David took the paper back. He checked the signatures. He looked at me one last time, a silent communication passing between us. The trap is sprung. Thank you, David said. He placed the signed stipulation on top of the will. By signing this, you have legally binded the estate to the results contained in this report. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a large, sealed white envelope with the logo of the genetic testing laboratory stamped in red on the front. It was thick. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, a look of pure triumph on her face. She looked at me across the table, her eyes glittering with malice. Last chance to walk out with your dignity, Morgan, she said. Once he opens that, you're nothing. You'll be back to serving tables like your mother within a month. I didn't blink. Open it, David.
The sound of the heavy paper tearing seemed to echo off the bookshelves. David slid the contents out, 2 separate reports, stapled at the corners. Uncle Marcus leaned forward, his face tense. The interior designer in the corner stopped moving samples around. The air in the room seemed to vanish. David picked up the first report. He adjusted his glasses, his face unreadable. We will begin with the test for Morgan Lancaster, he announced. Vanessa smirked at Chloe. Chloe stifled a giggle. David cleared his throat. Based on the genetic markers compared against the sample provided by the deceased, the probability of paternity is 99.9%. He looked up. Morgan is Richard's biological daughter. The smile froze on Vanessa's face. It didn't disappear, it just fossilized. She blinked, confused. That's impossible, she stammered. The lab must have made a mistake, or you switched the samples. The chain of custody is unbroken, Vanessa said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming harder. Morgan is a Lancaster. That is a fact. Fine, Chloe snapped, though her voice shrill. So she gets a share, whatever. Just read mine so we can move on to the money. I watched Chloe. I watched the entitlement radiating off her, the absolute certainty that she was the center of the universe. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. David set my report down. He picked up the second document. He held it for a moment, looking at the girl he had watched grow up, knowing he was about to end her life as she knew it. The second report, David said, is for Chloe Lancaster. He turned the page. He didn't look up this time. He just read the data. Based on the genetic markers compared against the sample provided by the deceased, the probability of paternity is 0%. David placed the paper on the table. Chloe, you are not Richard's biological daughter. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. It was as if time had stopped. Then the scream started. It wasn't a scream of grief. It was the high-pitched, jagged sound of a reality shattering into a million pieces. Chloe surged out of her chair, knocking it backward with a crash that shook the floorboards. She lunged across the oak table, her fingernails clawing at the report in David's hands. That is a lie, she shrieked, her face twisting into something ugly and unrecognizable. You forged it. You're working with her. I am Richard Lancaster's daughter. I am the only daughter. David didn't flinch. He simply pulled the document back out of her reach. Sit down, Chloe, David said, his voice cutting through her hysteria like a whip. Vanessa had gone the color of ash. She wasn't screaming. She was staring at the table, her hands trembling so violently that her diamond rings chattered against the wood. She knew. She had always known, and for 20 years she had gambled everything on the hope that Richard would take the secret to his grave. She didn't know he had left the truth in a biometric safe for me to find. Mom, Chloe spun toward Vanessa, grabbing her arm. Tell him he's lying. Tell him Dad is my father. Vanessa looked up, her eyes hollow. She tried to speak, that only a dry croak came out. It must be a lab error, Vanessa whispered, desperate. We demand a retest. There will be no retest, I said, speaking for the first time since the reveal. My voice was quiet, but in that silent library it sounded like thunder. I reached into my bag and pulled out the second file, the one from the safe. I slid the 12-year-old medical report across the table until it rested directly in front of Vanessa. Memorial Sloan Kettering, I said, 12 years ago, the bone marrow drive. Dad knew Vanessa. He matched 0 markers with Chloe. The doctors confirmed it then. He kept the secret to save Chloe's life while she was sick. He protected her. You used that protection to try and destroy me. Chloe stared at the medical file, reading the physician's notes. Her hands went slack. The fight drained out of her body, replaced by a horror so deep she looked like she might faint. She looked at her mother, betrayal dawning on her face. You knew? Mom? You told me. You swore. Vanessa closed her eyes, tears leaking out. I did it for us, Chloe. I did it to give you this life.
We aren't finished, David interrupted, merciless. He turned back to his briefcase. Now that the lineage has been legally established under the protocol you signed, we must address the estate distribution. He opened the last will and testament. Richard's instructions are explicit, David read. Article 7, Section B. The entirety of the Lancaster estate, including all real property, equity holdings, and cash reserves, shall be distributed solely to my biological issue. Any individual not sharing my genetic markers is expressly excluded from this bequest. David looked at Chloe. That means you, Chloe. You receive nothing. The trust fund, the condo, the allowance, it all reverts to the estate. You leave this house today with only your personal effects. Chloe collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing. But I have rights, Vanessa suddenly snapped, her survival instinct kicking in. She glared at me with venomous hate. I am his widow. I have a prenuptial agreement. I am entitled to 30% of the assets plus the Manhattan townhouse. You can't touch that. Actually, I said, I can. I opened the Project V folder, the shadow ledger. David, I said, please explain the bad faith clause in the prenup. David nodded. If the spouse is found to have engaged in theft, embezzlement, or fraud against the principal during the marriage, the prenuptial agreement is voided in its entirety, and the spouse forfeits all marital assets. Vanessa laughed, a brittle, hysterical sound. I never stole anything. I was his wife. You were a leech, I said coldly. I opened the ledger and started reading the line items. October 2 years ago, $400,000 to VM Interiors, a shell company registered to your maiden name. March last year, $200,000 for consulting fees to a firm that doesn't exist. Over the last 5 years, Vanessa, you siphoned $3,200,000 out of Dad's personal accounts. I threw the photos of the bank transfers onto the table. They fanned out like a winning poker hand. Dad tracked every cent, I said. He was building a case. He was going to divorce you the month he died. He just ran out of time. But I didn't. Vanessa stared at the ledger, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She looked at Uncle Marcus, hoping for an ally. Uncle Marcus stood up slowly. He looked at the DNA results. He looked at the theft ledger. Then he looked at Vanessa with absolute disgust. You tried to ruin my brother's daughter, Marcus said, his voice shaking with rage. You stole from him while he was dying, and you lied about that girl's parentage to steal a legacy that doesn't belong to you. Marcus turned to the security guard standing by the door. Get them out, Marcus ordered. Now. No, Vanessa screamed, grabbing the edge of the table. I live here. This is my house. Not anymore, David said, closing the briefcase. The house belongs to Morgan. You have 48 hours to vacate. If you are not gone, the police will be called to escort you out. And Vanessa, the forensic accounting team is forwarding this ledger to the district attorney this afternoon. You might want to save whatever money you have left for a criminal defense lawyer. Security stepped forward. One guard took Vanessa by the elbow. Another moved toward Chloe. Chloe stood up, wiping her face. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes red. She looked at me, then at her mother. She pulled her arm away from the guard and stepped back from Vanessa. Don't touch me, Vanessa spat at her mother. You did this. You lied to me my whole life. Chloe, baby, please, Vanessa sobbed, reaching for her. Don't, Chloe said. She looked at me one last time. There was no arrogance left, just shame. She walked out of the library alone. Vanessa was dragged out a moment later, screaming threats that nobody listened to. The heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off her voice. Silence rushed back into the room. The air felt cleaner instantly.
Uncle Marcus walked over to me. He placed a hand on my shoulder. He would have been proud of you today, Morgan. You didn't just survive them, you beat them at their own game. I looked down at the empty table where they had sat minutes ago, so sure of their victory. They wanted to protect the bloodline, I said quietly, tracing the wood of my father's desk. I looked up at David.
File the papers, David. It's time to go to work. 6 months later, the air in the master study didn't smell like stale tobacco and secrets anymore. It smelled of fresh espresso and the crisp ozone of a desert rainstorm coming through the open French doors. I sat in my father's leather chair, my chair now, and watched the ink dry on the final incorporation documents for the Richard Lancaster Foundation. The silence in the mansion was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. It was an update from David Thorne regarding the Vanessa matter, as we now called it. Vanessa didn't get to keep the Manhattan townhouse. She didn't get the 30% share. The forensic audit I handed over to the district attorney was so comprehensive that her lawyers advised her to take the first plea deal offered. She is currently living in a rented one-bedroom apartment in Yonkers, awaiting sentencing for grand larceny and wire fraud. Her friends, the women she spent 20 years trying to impress, dropped her the second the indictment hit the papers. She sends me letters sometimes, begging for a meeting, claiming she has essential information about the estate. I burn them unopened in the fireplace, watching the paper curl into ash, just like her lies. But the real surprise was Chloe. I expected her to fight. I expected lawsuits, tabloids, and claw marks on the doorframes. Instead, she vanished. 3 days after the reading, a small package arrived at the main gate. Inside was every piece of jewelry Richard had ever bought her: the diamond tennis bracelet, the Cartier watch, the pearl necklace. There was no note, just the keys to her Mercedes and the deed to the condo she had walked away from. I hired a private investigator, not to harass her, but just to know. He found her in a small town outside Bend, Oregon. She goes by Mia now. She rents a studio apartment above a garage and works the open shift at a local coffee roaster. The report said she spends her weekends hiking alone. No influencers, no entourage, no Lancaster money. She was the victim of Vanessa's lie too. And in a strange way, losing the name was the only thing that could save her. She finally looked like a real person in the grainy surveillance photos. Tired, wearing an apron, but real. I told the investigator to close the file. She had paid her price. I looked down at my hand. Resting on my finger was a vintage emerald ring, my grandmother Margaret's ring. Elena had found it in the safe deposit box Vanessa couldn't access. It fit perfectly, heavy and green and cool against my skin. I wasn't hoarding the billion-dollar empire for myself. The documents in front of me established a trust dedicated to providing legal and financial aid to victims of financial abuse and parental alienation. I was using the Lancaster fortune to make sure no other child ever felt as small as I did sitting in those pews. I picked up the iron skeleton key, the one Elena had slipped into my hand at the funeral. It sat on my desk now as a paperweight, a reminder that the truth is always there, waiting for someone brave enough to turn the lock. People think family is about who you share a holiday dinner with. They think it's about the photo on the Christmas card. But I learned that family isn't just about blood, and it certainly isn't about names. It is about truth. It is about the people who protect you when you are vulnerable, like my father did for a child that wasn't his, and like he did for me from beyond the grave. I stood up and walked to the door of the study. I didn't need to lock it anymore. The ghosts were gone. If you made it to the end of this story, remember this. The truth doesn't just set you free. It gives you the power to burn down the lies that held you captive. Build your own table, earn your own seat, and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong. I'm Morgan Lancaster, and this is finally my house.